Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good evening. My name is Ian Bourland. I'm an art historian in Washington, D.C. at Georgetown University and a contributing editor at Frieze. And I'll be hosting a conversation with Mikhael Subotzky this evening as part of Photo London and our online series. I feel like Mikhael's one of these guys who doesn't really need much introduction. He's been making high impact, globally recognized work almost from the outset of his career some 20 years ago. And within 7 years of graduating from Michaelis School of the Arts, he was named a full member of Magnum Photos. But it's worth noting, just to contextualize our conversation a bit, he's been featured, of course, in group shows and individual shows, both throughout South Africa and internationally. And many of you might know him from his wonderful artist books, which I think several of which are basically industry standard at this point. These include 2008's Beaufort West, named for an important site in his work, a town in the Western Cape, as well as a style compilation of his work, Retinal Shift, which was published on the occasion of his winning the Standard Bank Young Artists Award, a very prestigious and crucial award for artists in South Africa in 2012. And his collaboration, Ponty's City, with Patrick Waterhouse is another must-have tome for photo enthusiasts, and it spans over 5 years worth of material. I've been really excited to watch his work over the past decade because he's been elaborating themes that have animated his work for a long time. And he's also, I think, taken the medium of photography in some really exciting and bold new directions, particularly working through multimedia and video projects as well. His most recent material is, I think, incredibly timely and is of a piece with ongoing conversations we're having globally right now around memory, memorial, and our debts to the past as measured by our present. So for this week, we're celebrating his work at Photo London, of course, as well as very soon, I think, a retrospective of material at the SF MoMA here in the US, as well as some work at the Goodman Gallery in London, which opens up, as I understand, in about a month's time, and it's very exciting. So I think with that in mind, I will get the conversation going, but I should note at the top here that we'll talk for about 40 minutes or so. But if you have questions, there's a little button down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can submit a question. And we will look to those questions towards the end of our session here and take those in turn. So hang in there, we'll come around to that. So I think what we're going to do first, however, is look at just a snippet of some brand new work of the kind you'll start to see in the months ahead, and sort of work forward from there. So Mikhael, do you mind just telling us what we're going to look at here, and then maybe we'll play the clip?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for the introduction. We are going to look at a 2-minute clip from the new film that I'm making, which is called Epilogue, Disordered and Flatulent. This is a project that I've been working on for about 2.5 years now. And I see it very much as the third of a triptych of films alongside my 2 previous films, Moses and Griffiths and Why. So yeah, let's just play it and then we can talk from there. I'm going to go ahead with that.
And when I wake up,
de secunde flank. De flank.
taking out, you know what I do? I have a tension in my pocket. The time is changing, too much changing, the prices, the produce, the sleep also with the tension. The internet is I don't need to search and find the tension. When you get it, oh, I think assignment, but a lot of writing full of flash. Burn my two ends here at the stove. Let's go.
Great, thank you. So a lot there. It's very sort of visually and dense, and also in terms of media. And what I love about that is that we see, of course, the gesture of the hand and mark making, and there's the sonic dimension, but there are also sort of fragments and callbacks to your earlier work. And that first image that we see, that sort of side hand, is one of your works that's really circulated globally, I think. And is that Hermanus, that figure? Can you tell the audience a little bit about this fellow and how he made his way into your work? Because I think he's sort of a motif in many of your projects.
Yeah, so Hermanus is a man I met in 2005. I was at the time doing what was my second project, which was called Umjigwana, which was photographs of ex-prisoners. And I met him on a building site and asked if I could take his photograph, and he said yes. And the photograph I took, you know, the moving image that we see in that clip is based on that photograph, which I'm kind of manipulating and eroding, taking away frame by frame. But over the years, I kept in touch with Hermanus, and we became a kind of strange type of, I guess, friends. And no, I shouldn't make light of it. It's a very meaningful relationship in my life, and I think in his too. Of course, a very complex relationship with all the kind of weight of the history of racial and class and economic divisions in South Africa. Hermanus at the time lived on the building site that I photographed him on, and to this day still lives on the streets in very difficult circumstances. So there's a lot in that relationship that is difficult and requires a lot of kind of thinking to come to terms with, but it's something that I'm kind of very committed to doing and really value and learn so much from Hermanus. He made a kind of cameo appearance in my second film, W-Y-E, where he kind of, as a kind of counterpoint or inflection point, his presence in this film, that kind of the rest of the narrative turns around. And then, I photographed him over the years. And what's interesting also for me about the relationship, Y was my first fictional film, and he kind of made that transition with me from my quote unquote documentary work into my quote unquote fictional work. And now this film Epilogue, which is really about father figures, there's something in our relationship and our ages that kind of speaks to the complexity of father figures.
Absolutely. Well, I want to return to this idea of erosion and the picking away. I think what's so exciting about your practice in many ways for me is the ways in which so many of these sort of dimensions around the ethics of privilege, class, and race in South Africa, but also I would say globally, are investigated in terms of both content and in the medium. And it's something you've really very openly sort of wrestled with in the past decade after this kind of meteoric rise, making more traditionally legible work, I would say. So your first several series involved sort of carceral sites, prisoners, as well as in general, like a kind of more documentary style, very, very beautiful images in color, certainly. I just wonder if you can just sort of situate us when you were coming out of school, of how you entered into this kind of rich tradition that you were already sort of inheriting in some ways, thinking of father figures, both globally in terms of Magnum, of course, in the photo essay generally, but also in South Africa in particular. You've got your Magubanes and Coles, as well as your Goldblatts and folks in the Bang Bang Club. So that's a pretty heady sort of legacy. So how did you sort of conceive your entry into that world?
Yeah, well, the main father figure was quite literally my uncle, Gideon Mendel. Although in some ways he's kind of he's quite a lot younger than my mother, so he's in some more like a cousin in some ways, but also like a father figure. But he taught me a huge amount about the kind of basics of photography. Sorry, not the basics of photography, but like the kind of basics of a documentary practice. And I learned a huge amount from him. And then as I progressed, yeah, Goldblatt for me was the one that I really looked up to, and so admired his vast, endless project of photographing the kind of South Africa, the socio-political and the topographic experience of South Africa over so many years with such discipline. And I kind of for many years wanted to do the same, wanted to emulate them. And it was quite a painful process, to be honest, realizing that that actually wasn't my course, and that I was interested in other things. And me can read it in edible terms, but yeah, in some ways I had to kind of kill the father in my own mind creatively in order to find my own path.
Yeah, and so, you know, something about Goldblatt's practice, I mean, I think even right at the end of his life a few years ago, sadly, of course, he never really admitted to being an artist. You know, we tend to think of him in the art world that way. He's represented by galleries, of course, but he was this very sort of regimented, disciplined, as you say, sort of sociologist of the image. But I do think there's a very aesthetic dimension to your work as well. It's very plain in the more recent work. And he was also sort of working, I think, you know, during the kind of high watermark of apartheid. And, you know, when you're graduating from school, this was a time of still relative optimism in South Africa, I would say. So, you know, what was sort of the exigency for these early projects? What was your sort of entree?
Yeah, so I graduated in 2004 from Michaelis, and that's when it was my graduation project, the Ifiruka, the photographs of prisons. It was, so that was 10 years after our first democratic elections, and we celebrate, today is 27th of April, so I can't calculate how many years now from 1994, but 2004 was 10 years on. And it was really, and that was very much where my interest came from. It was kind of, yeah, the kind of honeymoon period of kind of Mandela and rainbowism was kind of really beginning to, yeah, I guess we were all really beginning to question it. And there was a constitutional court case in 2004 around whether prisoners could or couldn't vote in the election of that year. And I was just found it quite crazy and unimaginable that in this particular democracy, where almost all of our political leaders had been in prison at some point, we were now questioning the right of prisoners to vote. And it coincided with this kind of middle-class outrage around the very real threat of violence and crime, but a threat of violence and crime that was very much related to the failure to start addressing the structural inequality of apartheid. So all those things kind of came together for me in a way that allowed me to kind of follow my interests of looking at the world and discovering the world around me and trying to represent that. Yeah.
It seems like to me that there's a kind of interest in the carceral in maybe all of your work on some level, and I think that plays out in a couple different ways at different times. And so these earlier projects are quite literally staged in the context of prisons. Some of the work was displayed in the context of prisons and around imprisoned people. It seems like this elaborates beyond that sort of senior year project into more complex registers, and one detects maybe some close reading of theorists like Foucault as well. And I'm just wondering, from that first project, how did that sort of effloresce for you, this idea of the carceral?
Yeah, I think that's important, and I'd actually like to go back to something in answering that, something you mentioned earlier, where around the kind of the form, where the gestures I make later on, which I'm sure we're going to get to, around ripping, smashing, tearing, taking images apart, and which we saw in the film. You know, all of that for me is part of the same inquiry as the photographic gesture. It's just that, yeah, in some ways I needed the kind of the images themselves, the form of them, to reflect the vulnerability and the violence and the open wound of what I was looking at, whether that's photographically or through another medium. That sense of, I jokingly often refer to myself as a recovering photographer, but I actually think the inquiry along all of my work is very consistent in the way I'm thinking and looking at the world. And that was there from the beginning, like you say, with kind of reading Foucault and thinking about the panoptic gaze and kind of extending that into the panoramic photographs I was making, where I was, as an unseen viewer, I was taking the role of the guard in the scheme of the panopticon. So all along, the attempt has been there to engage with the world on the level of content in a particular way, but also make work that writes that engagement into the material itself.
And so who were you making those early works for? I mean, was it just kind of to try to get a footing in the market, or are you trying to speak to a certain sort of white constituency in the Joburg suburbs, or were you trying to speak directly to those imprisoned people? I mean, what was the mode of address?
You know, I believed in the power of documentary photography to kind of do some sort of good in the world by showing the things that we might not otherwise notice and take heed of. And this is something I have a very complex relationship now with that belief. I don't know if I necessarily believe it anymore, but I did at the time. And I felt like it was in some ways a useful thing to do. And I thought a lot about the audience. So like you said, the first exhibition I did after graduating was in Pollsmoor Prison, where to some degree, I still think it's the best exhibition I ever did, because I managed to get a couple of hundred members of the public into a working maximum security prison in order to look at the work alongside some of the prisoners who I'd photographed. And that was quite an experience, I think, to see those photographs and hear the sounds of prison and the smells of the food boiling. And so I wanted the audience to be as wide as possible. And I also wanted to, all those, like you say, in the white suburbs or the affluent suburbs, to kind of see what was just around the corner, what was hidden, what, the structures of not just apartheid society, but I guess capitalist society likes us to stay hidden. So believing in the utility of that. But later on, I think I did grow quite frustrated with the fact that we put these photographs up on the walls, apart from specific instances like in the prison itself, and that, kind of still be kind of consumed by the market and by the viewer for their kind of aesthetic qualities. And that's really where the smashing of the photographs came in for the first time in 2000. I mean, I showed a smashed photograph for the first time in 2012, but I kind of had the instinct to do it a couple of years earlier. And one of the things that I kind of enjoyed after playing around with it was that it kind of got in the viewer's way and got in the way of their ability to consume the image. It kind of, really literally put a filter between them and the representation and drew them back to the surface of the image, reminding them of its plasticity, that it's not just this magical window into another world that they can just consume passively. I think the smash kind of almost pointed their gaze a little bit back at them, amongst many other things. So,
Yeah. And so for those of you in the audience, you know, so Mikhael develops over 7 or 8 years this very rich body of work, mostly in color, the sorts of things you would, you know, love to see at a gallery and perhaps purchase. And then he begins to display works where the surface of the frame seems smashed almost like a windscreen or the part of your, you know, little side window of a car, which ties back into the title of this talk, of the traffic light incident with the little smashed window. And so I think that's important. So rather than say destroying your work like John Baldessari or just sort of taking it out of the marketplace, you're sort of reinstantiating it and demonstrating the kind of screen effect of photography and bringing us back to the surface, which I think is kind of a sort of a skeleton key towards this kind of second phase of your practice, wherein you're doing things that are sort of para-photographic, let's say, or using sort of photographically legible materials, but then disrupting it in some way or another. And it seems like that turning point's really right around the time of Retinal Shift in 2012.
Yeah, so the smashed works were a part of a installation, I guess, called I Was Looking Back. I wonder if this stage would it make sense to get some of the images up in the background and we can talk to them. Could we get the slideshow up, please? Yeah. And maybe we can go straight to image number 14. Yeah, so that is one of the images I smashed, and then the next image is image number 15, please. Yeah. So this is actually just a small selection of I Was Looking Back, and you see, you might not see very clearly there, but some of the photographs are smashed. And to make this installation, I took months going through literally every single photograph I'd ever taken in my life until that point. And I chose some of the kind of quote unquote iconic images, but also, you know, other ones which were more personal, or the frame next to the iconic frame. And in every single image in this installation, the subject is kind of looking back in a very particularly loaded kind of way. It might be, yeah, I chose images where there was a tension in the relationship between myself, the photographer, and the subject. And then when you add the viewer comes into the room and is faced with all these kind of loaded gazes, and I think hopefully becomes very aware of their own gaze back at the photographs. And then, yeah, the smashing kind of adds to that.
Yeah, and that's a thread I want to pick up on a little more in a few minutes, but we also kind of, in the slide deck, sort of zipped by one of your really, I think, maybe internationally your most famous work, this collaboration around this building in downtown Johannesburg, Ponte City. And for those of you who haven't been to Joburg, it's one of these buildings you can see sort of across the city. It's an iconic skyscraper and housing development. And so you worked on that for several years with Patrick in a variety of forms. And what always struck me about both that work and some of the works you have on the wall here in 2012 is that you're being very self-critical in this instance, but your work to me seems very collaborative in the first instance, actually. And it seems like in Ponte City, that was part of the story as well, where you weren't coming in as this kind of voyeur or kind of ethnographer, but you were trying to do something where you were really engaged with your subjects.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe we can go back to image number 8 and then 9. Yeah, so, you know, for me, the most important, when talk collaboration happens on many levels. So obviously the most important one is kind of with the subject. I'd like to talk that more a little bit later when we talk about the films, because filmmaking was a kind of revelation around that for me. But yeah, I met Patrick Waterhouse in 2007 on a residency in Italy, and we kind of, yeah, for a year maybe before we started this work, we just kind of enjoyed talking to each other and bouncing ideas around. And then I left that residency, came back to South Africa, and this project kind of just materialized. And it was in many ways almost just an excuse to work with Patrick, because we really wanted to work together. And then this was kind of, I'd moved from Cape Town to Johannesburg, and this building became a way of exploring my new city. And one of the things that could never have happened other than in a collaborative way is the photographs we took over 3 years of every door, every window, and every television screen in the building. So if you can go to the next slide and then the one after that. Yeah, okay, so this one, that's literally a grid of every door, every window and television in the building. We went from the top of the building to the bottom, knocking on every single door. The grids are arranged completely true to the logic of the building. So what you see there, it's pretty, we don't have more close-up details, but maybe go to the next slide. We've kind of made these into 4-meter high light boxes where the apertures of the building, again, it's about looking out of the building or looking in the building becomes kind of, arranged. We remove the concrete and we just have the apertures. And actually, I'm very excited about this because while we were doing the doors, windows, and televisions between 2008 and 2010, we also did a fourth typology, which was the internal windows of the building. Because it's hollow in its core, it has these windows that face inward from the passageways. We did this crazy amount of photographs there, literally not just across, but also up and down. So it became such a nightmare to organize it because it had to be like these, organized completely true to the building. So the one floor above the other and sequentially left to right. We just ran out of time in 2010 when we were putting them together to finish that one. It was always at the back of our minds that we should do it sometime. But over the last couple of years, we have finished that fourth typology. And it will be shown for the first time at Photo London. So, we've been working on the production of the Lightbox, and I'm incredibly excited to actually see it at physically the right size.
So I wonder, it feels collaborative in that, of course, you've done the work of meeting with people and sort of giving them a platform in a building that in some ways feels like a fortification, sort of sealed off from sort of everyday traffic, ironically, even though it's in the center of this downtown part of Johannesburg. But I wonder too, you say typology, and for me that really has a kind of resonation with the Dusseldorf School, Bernd and Hille Becker, and the kind of conceptual studies of the 1960s and 70s. So I wonder how that sort of jives with some of the anxieties you have around subjecting, fellow South Africans to a more typological or ethnographic lens, because it seems to be you're resisting that as well.
Yeah, so it's a great way into saying that. I love this. Me and Patrick described our approach as semi-German. So we tried our absolute best to keep track of every photo to make sure they were in the right order and we were in the right position, the same distance away from the window and the door. But sometimes it was just impossible because of the building. Like there was a cupboard in front of, where we should be standing to photograph that particular door. So, and where that was, the photograph's a little bit out. So it's like got that kind of German kind of typological kind of discipline, but also, and life gets in the way of that. And I think that's also where it's really a reflection on modernity and in architecture in particular. But so the idea of photographing every aperture of the building came from something Patrick read, where Le Corbusier said the apertures somehow represent the spirit of the building. So it was like, okay, so what if we just are left with the apertures and remove, like I said earlier, the concrete. So we did our best to do that, but life got in the way. And, in the Windows typology, there's curtains and things in the way and television screens. We wanted to see out to the landscape because the landscape kind of stitches itself together in a panoramic way, which gives a sense of the building at the center of the city. But yeah, people wanted to be in the photograph sometimes and got in the way of it. With the doors, we knocked on every door and asked people whether they wanted to be in the photograph. If they said yes, we photographed them, great. There's some beautiful images of people holding their kids or cooking their dinner, in the kitchen behind them. If they didn't, then we just photographed the door itself. And that took on its own meaning because in the image of the doors you see on the right there of this image, the surface has become a kind of archaeology of the building, where the red doors at the top were from the 1970s, from the original construction. The blue doors were lower down, were actually like blue lights on black doors from the failed renovations of 2008. So you kind of read the history of the building off the surfaces of the doors in this instance, right to when we got to the bottom, right hidden away in a non-public now area of the building, we found doors to the old public bathrooms, which still said European gentlemen only and European ladies only, which was just, in South Africa, European meant white, and was just kind of horrific to suddenly realize that that was still kind of stenciled onto the building itself in 2010.
Because this building was sort of synonymous with a kind of sort of urbane downtown kind of white wealth in the 1970s when it was built, yeah?
Exactly, yeah. So it was built for kind of upwardly mobile, white, inner city living. And, you know, the project encompasses also a huge amount of archival material, which we collected, including the advertisements from the 70s when it was built, yeah, kind of catering to that market. And then in 2008, when it was being kind of supposedly revitalized and gentrified, we found very similar marketing, which was kind of just hilarious almost, in that it was the same, just now kind of aimed at a upwardly mobile, affluent black market. So, and then in between, you have this kind of sense of this building going downhill, and how that talks about like kind of narratives around Johannesburg, and all of it is stories. And I think that's what the project is about more than anything else. It's about how a cloud of stories, often contradictory and crazy, kind of attaches itself to this building, and the building becomes a kind of a projection surface onto which Johannesburg kind of projects the best and the worst of itself.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting hinge point as well to the sort of projects you started embarking on for the retinal shift sort of era, let's say. You know, if those first 7 or 8 years are kind of about what Foucault would call sort of heterotopic space, these kinds of places within a society that are also places of exclusion or exception, like the colony or the prison, or in this case, a building that has this kind of liminal sort of fortified status. With your work with film in Grahamstown in 2012, that's really, I see you sort of opening on to the city more broadly in the landscape as well. So I wonder if you could, at the same time though, you're still thinking about this kind of leitmotif of the photographic, the aperture, optical technology, the panoptics. So I wonder if you could talk about Moses and Griffiths a little bit and the genesis of that project.
Absolutely. Can we go to slide 16, please? And yeah, Moses and Griffiths, I made in 2011 and showed for the first time in 2012 alongside, I was looking back with the rest of Retinal Shift. And yeah, the move towards filmmaking was, you know, it came very much from meeting these two men, Moses and Griffiths, and realizing that the story that I wanted to tell with them was kind of only really tellable, if that's a word, through moving images and sound. So yeah, I met both Moses and Griffiths in Grahamstown while doing research for my exhibition there, and they were both tour guides. I say were, they both have sadly passed on since then. So they were both giving tours in public museums. Moses in the 19th century Camera Obscura, which had been set up as a museum. I'm not seeing the right slide. If we can't load it up, number 16, maybe we just take the screen share off. Okay, I'll try to keep talking while that happens. Then maybe when they're ready, they can load it up again. Yeah. So Moses and Griffiths, yeah, Moses was giving tours to school children and tourists through this restored 19th century Camera Obscura. It was the most kind of visually compelling and amazing instrument to me, especially seeing as I was kind of at the time really kind of questioning the photographic gaze in new ways. Thank you. So here you see Moses and Griffiths installed. That was actually at the Yale Art Gallery. And then on the next screen, on the next slide, you'll see Griffiths first. Griffiths was also a tour guide. He was giving tours in the 1820 Settlers Monument, which is also part of the the very messed up fabric of Grahamstown. And so keep going to 18, if you don't mind, the next slide, and then the one after that. That's Griffiths, and then you'll see Moses in the next one. And in the next one after that, you'll see his camera obscura. And then the next one after that, you will see a close-up of footage that I shot through the camera obscura. So let's just pause on the slides here. So the visuals of this camera obscura were remarkable, but for me, even more remarkable than that was the history that Moses was telling. It was it was shocking, to be honest. It was Moses, a 70-something-year-old black man in 2011, was telling white colonial history from the perspective of the colonizers, in this case, the English colonizers in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. And even more remarkably, Griffiths was doing the same in the monument. So these two men were telling this history that just was completely inappropriate. So I wanted to kind of reflect on that. So I filmed both of their tours as they were giving it in this kind of old school way. And then over a couple of months, I worked with both of them on their own personal tours where they told their own history. Where I asked them to tell their own history using the same format, the camera obscura or the monument as a kind of a way of talking through these histories. Immediately when we started workshopping these personal tours, they became so alive and honest on a different level and connected to what they were saying, and emotional and political and reflective in a really interesting way, whereas they were telling the official histories almost by rote, as if they, in order just to keep repeating them, they had to kind of absent themselves. And for me, this spoke so kind of strongly to institutional violence that allowed this still to be happening, but also more importantly, a kind of psychological state of splitness where these two men were being forced to hold these two very different narratives inside themselves and not being able to integrate them. So what we do in the presentation of the film is all four of those tours play opposite each other. So the viewer can't watch them all at the same time and has to deal with the fracture, but try and put it together and understand them talking over each other, sometimes contradicting themselves, sometimes contradicting each other, but the narratives form in a way that you really understand that there's something beyond the initial official tour. There's this really powerful, poignant personal history. So for me, the great revelation was realizing that by collaborating over a couple of months on something that was still a kind of documentary portrait of these two men, involving them in the kind of creation of this narrative really helped me to speak to something that I would never have been able to do through still photographs.
Yeah, and part of what I especially love about this is that there is this really fraught history of landscape painting in the colonial scheme more generally, but especially in South Africa. If we think about people like Pringle, for instance, or Kodze has written pretty extensively about the way in which landscape painting and photography had sort of set up for the British, in particular, the sort of landscape as a surveilled and potentially colonized space. And that's part of what the camera obscura is doing, kind of creating that panoptic view in a non-explicitly carceral situation. And that's a very fraught history to be engaging with. And so what you're doing here is, like those smash photos, resisting the kind of legibility that you might otherwise have from the official tour or the sort of the panoptic view. But it also seems like, if we're kind of looking back over the last 10 years, sort of two trajectories really emerge for you out of this film. On the one hand, it seems like you're turning away from sort of the documentary of sort of what's happening around you per se, towards a more retrospective investigation of colonialism and white settlement and the knowledge structures around that. That comes through really clearly in your next film, Why, for instance, and of course the current work. And then sort of technologically, you seem to be investigating what a camera can do. This is a camera obscura, but you're also sort of breaking down or eroding camera technologies and that legibility through things like the sticky tape transfer or the multi-channel film.
Yeah, absolutely. So that reflection, thank you, goes straight into the next film, Why. So if we can go to the next slide, which, in many ways I thought of as a follow-up to Moses and Griffiths. And exactly like Ian said, I kind of wanted to think about looking at the landscape as the first step in taking ownership and stealing the land. And I wanted to now try and inhabit the colonial subject and kind of collapse the assumptions and arrogances and power dynamics of the colonial subject from within, rather than, as I think I'd been doing in the documentary work previously, kind of describing its effects from without on the other. And Coetzee's white writing was actually a very important kind of, all the references you mentioned to kind of 19th century romantic painting. And Coetzee talks very much about the failure of the colonial imagination here, how it couldn't get to grips with the South African landscape. Why, which is spelled W-Y-E, was actually commissioned by an Australian foundation. So it looked at this kind of three-way triangular projection between the English, South African, and Australian landscapes, and how, so projection in every sense of the word, a map projection, the projected image, and also psychological projection. And so we have three characters who are all in some form colonizers, and they are all looking at the landscape in a way that, I guess, reveals the colonial assumptions that the land is there waiting to either be discovered in a sense of technology or to be taken ownership of. In the next slide, we see one of the characters, Lethbridge. He's literally looking at the landscape through a, what do you call them? The black mirror, named after the painter. I've completely gone blank on the name of the device. But he's trying to understand it and comprehend it. The next slide, a contemporary white South African called Craig Hare is metal detecting his way through that landscape. And he comes across in the next slide, Hermanus, who helps him dig out something that he found with the metal detector. And that's the encounter I spoke of earlier that kind of is a real turning point for Craig Hare's relationship to the South African landscape. He goes back to his home, and in the next slide writes a letter to his aunt in Australia talking about wanting to immigrate. So I was really looking at this kind of white South African impulse to move to Australia, where they have all the same kind of relationships with the land as us here in South Africa, but just with without all the quote unquote problems, which is a hugely problematic view because, of course, Australia's, the colonial project there in many ways dealt with those problems just a little bit more barbarically and cruelly than us. But so I really break down the myth of this relationship that us kind of white South Africans have with the landscape, and try to do that by showing the failure of all three of the characters. I forget to mention that the third character is called Feo and is a disembodied being from the future. He's actually inhabiting his body while he writes this email and trying to study it in a kind of pseudo-futuristic anthropological sense. Each of those three characters think they have the technology to understand the landscape or embodiment, but they kind of fail or become seduced by the process. It becomes a kind of three-way loop, a triangle of space and time that turns in on itself and repeats itself. Filmmaking is kind of very, very important language by now, but the research, if you can go to the next slide, is really around pulling images apart and combining them. So this is a painting of Robert Gordon, one of the kind of colonial leaders here in South Africa, and an image of a plant that he drew. He was one of those kind of explorers who drew and lovingly drew the fauna and the flora and the animals, and then kind of picked them or shot the animals after lovingly drawing it. So, I wanted to kind of combine him with his drawing. And so this is what I call a sticky tape transfer, where I take literally clear tape and push it against the ink of a print and pull it away. And sometimes, yeah, the images get pulled apart and combined in a whole lot of ways. In this way, it's taking parts of the image on the left and the right and combining it in the center. So his spine literally becomes a part of that flower. And on the next slide, this is actually a film still of one of the characters from Y. And, you know, my instinct is always to work in a very kind of controlled way. I'm a bit of a kind of germaphobe. I always like to do things in a neat way. And my wife, Maria, has been, you know, incredibly helpful in pushing me to kind of confront my fears through my work. And so she really pushed me and has helped me with what I call this type of sticky tape transfer, where, you know, we go to the back of the tape after it's pulled the image away and scrub away at it with a sponge and water. The ink is water-based ink, so it kind of removes some of it. And this speaks very much to you know, the sense that these characters are ghosts. They're kind of haunting the film, they're haunting us. And in the next slide, you'll see a more recent series of that type of sticky tape transfer, which I call the Gangster series, where this is actually a portrait that became a very important kind of starting point for the current film, Epilogue. It's a portrait of supposedly Jan van Riebeeck. That was the famous portrait of him that went onto our banknotes. For those of you who remember, in the film that we showed at the beginning, there's a kind of clip of the Jan van Riebeeck on the banknote as the image falls apart around him. And that image recently was discovered not actually to be him. It's another man, Dutch merchant called Bartholomeus Vermeer. And so, you know, that really is about this kind of transformation of, and Bartholomeus Vermeer was, of course, a much kind of uglier man. So the kind of canonization of Henry Riebeeck as this father of a nation, which is really at the center, problematizing that is at the center of Epilogue, the film that I'll present next month for the first time.
Fantastic. And this really ties all of that into one of the questions we have from the audience here. She asks first if what other media you've sort of been considering working through, and I think you've discussed that in some detail here, but I want to go to the sort of beginning of her question. She says, can you please elaborate on what you meant by identifying yourself as a recovering photographer? Because it seems like, well, I think as a photo historian, I can trace a lot of motifs and resonances with sort of the medium technologically. It does seem like you've gone kind of far afield. So have you abandoned the medium altogether, or what's there for a young photographer, perhaps?
Yeah, so me saying a recovering photographer is tongue in cheek, and that I kind of, you know, I both like and I dislike talking about the departure from photography, because on the one hand, yes, of course, an interrogation of photography and the medium itself and the gaze of the medium and the materiality of the medium is essential to a lot of what I've done. At the same time, like I said earlier, I don't think that there's any fundamental difference between the kind of intellectual inquiry that was at the heart of my photographic work and the work that I made post-recovering from photography, like through the series of images that we've just seen. There's a kind of real kind of step-by-step connection where, you know, the eroding of the image and the questioning of the gaze becomes very important. Yeah, it's also just been on a kind of personal level, been very liberating for me to understand, well, to claim the right to work in many different ways, because they are, you know, I think with the way that, you know, this is a Photo London talk, so we, you know, often artworks get shown on an art fair or a photo fair or a group exhibition kind of out of context or in the context of a different thesis that a curator might be bringing. So I think people have looked at my work over the last 10 or so years and struggled to place it in this kind of sequence of erosion. And that's fine. That's just how it is. In some ways, I think it would be easier for me if it was more legible, but I didn't want to get stuck. We spoke earlier about Goldblatt, you know, and my admiration for him and his lifetime project is still huge and is still there, but I didn't want to just be doing the same kind of thing in again and again, but you know, with a different subject or different. I really kind of needed to claim the right to just experiment, and also to make failures, to try things that might not work. You know, I graduated and went straight to exhibiting my work all over the world, and you know, ideally there would have been more time. Not that I'm complaining about that, but ideally, you know, young artists need time to develop and to try things and to fail. And it was very difficult to claim the space to do that in the public kind of glare, but it's something that, in retrospect, I'm very glad I somehow managed to do.
Yeah, and I had the privilege of, it's been 3 or 4 years since I visited your studio and sort of seeing where the work was and where it's gone. I mean, it's so fully realized and came out so well. So it's interesting to hear about that experimental process. We have another question, and we have about 5 or 6 minutes left in a pretty full room. So we do have time probably for a few more questions if folks would like to type them in the bottom there. But we have one just here. This person asks, thank you for the conversation. If there is time, I would like to hear more about the sonic element of the video clip. And that's something I was wondering about as well. So thank you very much. What is the operatic helping you explore or achieve, and how does the sonic operate in your other work?
Yeah, thank you again for the question. I kind of wish I'd had time to mention this earlier, but and it speaks to what Ian was talking about, collaboration. So I was very lucky at the start of, or near the start of this project 2 years ago, to meet the composer Jonathan Blair, who is based in Cape Town. At the time, I wasn't quite sure what the sonic element of Epilogue, this film, would be. But we just kind of fell into the most wonderful collaborative relationship where his composing would kind of feed into my editing as I made the stop motion frame by frame over the years. And then I would send him edits of that and structures, narrative structures, and he would kind of write that into the composition. So it's a kind of composition for a small orchestra, not so small actually, about 30 players, with 6 or 7 voices, who are all kind of operatic trained singers, but we really are playing with the form. The libretto is based on a text I wrote about the project, and it wasn't written as a libretto. So there's a great challenge in kind of translating it into the singing. But it's something that I would love to talk about for hours. And you know, at some stage, hopefully there'll be a chance to do that with Jonathan himself. But yeah, it's really kind of just reminded me how nourishing kind of these kind of collaborative relationships can be to a creative project when you find the right fit. And I feel very lucky to have met Jonathan. And just to say that for the audience who are in London, that film will premiere in an exhibition at Goodman Gallery in Cork Street, opening on the 9th of June. We've got another couple minutes. Are there any other questions we can field from the audience? See if anyone crops up here, but in the meantime, the sort of last thing sort of on my mind is you call this new film that's going to be at Goodman in a few months here a sort of epilogue, a kind of end of this Moses and Griffiths sort of triptych of films that you initiated over 10 years ago. Do you feel a kind of, I mean, catharsis or resolution, or do you feel like this is going to be the kind of motif that you pursue going forward? Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm still kind of coming to terms with that. I'm so focused on the work at the moment, but Epilogue is really a film about father figures. I spoke a little bit earlier about Jan van Riebeck and how he was canonized falsely as the father of a nation, and there was obviously political expediency in that. He only came here in 1652, and South Africa has a long history going way, way back before that. Yes, I'm looking at the violence of father figures, both in kind of national projects like that, but also on a very, very personal level. My complex and difficult relationship with my deceased father. Like I mentioned, also the complex kind of pseudo-father-son relationship between myself and Hermanus. And really it's about what we pass on from generation to generation, and where I think patriarchy is unexamined. What we pass on from father to son is a form of violence that manifests in many of the things we struggle with, and other people other than myself struggle with a whole lot more in the world right now. But yeah, hopefully by looking at these cycles, I'll provide a space where we kind of can reflect on patriarchy and the violence associated with masculinity. And just to answer your question, I think all three films really deal with that. Maybe the third one now, Epilogue, more consciously, but it's exactly those themes around men trying to find their place in the world, and doing so often destructively, often without accepting their own vulnerability. And I think that inability to acknowledge one's own vulnerability is what has allowed particularly white men to project a lot of violence, not just project, but like perpetuate a lot of violence out in the world. So yeah, it's about a space for that to be reflected on. And I am seeing a final question, which maybe I can go straight into, Ian. Might we do something with women in the future? So thank you for that question. Yeah, I think that question really reminds me that I think almost, I mean, there are some obviously women in the photographs that I've shown, but largely my work has been about men. And I think when it was less conscious earlier on, and when it's more conscious now, I've been attempting to place myself and find what it means to be in a white male body in this really difficult world that we live in, where white men have done so many terrible things over the last 500 years. And then, of course, you start breaking down race and what that even means. But, you know, so many Black artists are doing amazing work right now about kind of rewriting the Black body into the canon. And I think in some small way, it's really important for white artists to also kind of look at whiteness as a construct, and kind of collapse the assumptions of whiteness and the arrogances of whiteness from within the white body.
Great. Well, that's, I think, a great place to leave it. And I think we're right on time as well. So I want to say thank you all for joining us, and for all of you in the future joining us through Facebook. And thank you to Photo London for hosting this, our colleagues at Goodman Gallery for organizing, and to the man of the hour, Mikhael, for sharing his insight and his work with us today.
Can I add a huge thank you to you, Ian? As always, it's just such a great pleasure to engage with you, both personally, but also around the work. And I really appreciate your insight and thoughtfulness, and yeah, with all of that criticality that you've brought to reflecting on our work. It's very much appreciated.
Pleasure, as always. All right, I think that's it for us. Thank you all. Good evening.